You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Hi, my name is Jordan Lofthouse, and I'm a senior fellow with the Hayek Program. This episode of the Hayek Program podcast is another one in our mini-series on economics and the environment. Today, I'm very happy to be joined with my two colleagues, Nathan Goodman and Michaela Novak. Both of them are senior fellows with the Hayek Program. And today we'll be chatting about our recently published paper titled Militarized Climate Planning, What is Left, which was published in the Review of Austrian Economics. So Nathan and Michaela, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So just to jump straight in, so our paper that we wrote, it's kind of weird because we already wrote it, but now we're going to be talking about it. So I guess this is a point to maybe talk about where we are on the same track, maybe some points of where we might differ a little bit in our thinking, and to kind of give our listeners an overview of what our arguments are in our paper. But the core argument of our paper builds off the work of especially Don Lavoie and kind of the framing of Don Lavoie in his book, National Economic Planning, What is Left, which is where we kind of, echoed the what is left part of the title. And so in both of your overall research, I'm curious what you see as kind of Lavoie's most important insights, or how Lavoie's work has contributed to your overall understanding of political economy.
So for me, I think Lavoie's work is kind of pivotal. So I first read National Economic Planning, What is Left, when I was in undergrad. And the context in which I read it was, at the time, I was interested in anti-authoritarian leftist ideas, and I had some amount of interest in pro-market ideas. I had read some Hayek, but my view at the time when I first read Lavoie was that the core insight I had gotten from Hayek was local knowledge is important. So more localized or decentralized attempts at democratic planning and at planning out society and replacing markets with non-market modes of social organization were things I was more sympathetic to at the time. So I was very struck by the way Lavoie in National Economic Planning, What is Left, shows both a great sympathy for radical leftist positions, right? So within the first chapter, I think, is called Planning the Radical Perspective. The last chapter is What is Left. And in both of these chapters, he's really saying radical leftists are concerned with very serious social and structural problems: poverty, war, entrenched systems of privilege, right? And radical leftists are trying to seek out and understand the scientific causes of these severe social problems. But where Lavoie differed from the main positions that were held by radical leftists was in thinking a key part of how we solve those problems is through markets and through people experimenting from the bottom up and then having freedom to engage in exchange, through which they can acquire, discover, and use knowledge that they'd never be able to access if they were attempting to consciously plan. And so what he really gets at is that the underlying normative critique of entrenched systems of power that motivates radical leftists provides a set of reasons, once you understand social science, to be deeply concerned with the harms and regimentation associated with attempts at centralized economic planning. He argues that planning represents the militarization of the economy because it replaces bottom-up processes of social interaction with a more hierarchical mode of organization, a mode of organization akin to the command and control dynamics that we see in, for example, a military unit where a commander orders different people to carry out different functions within society. He argues that this is a problem that generates a knowledge problem and that generates a power problem. So there's a problem of you can't know what efficient use of scarce resources looks like, and that it creates positions of power that are going to generate incentives for abuse of power. And he further argues that this is a problem not just with the most obvious instances of this, centralized economic planning carried out by a central nation state, but also at attempts to engage in planning via something like so-called economic democracy. He has a whole chapter on planning from the bottom up. He has chapters on industrial policy and other forms of non-comprehensive planning. And so what I really learned and took away from that book when I first read it was, oh, this critique of centralized planning, one, is something I should care about very deeply as a leftist, as someone who thinks there's something radically wrong with a society built on hierarchy and power and regimentation and violence, right? And that this has deeper implications than just we shouldn't replicate the attempt of building a Soviet-style socialist state. It also has implications for so-called democratic socialist proposals, for proposals for industrial policy, and even for some so-called libertarian socialist proposals that involve more bottom-up democratic attempts at planning. And so that was really what was striking to me, is it made me realize the importance of markets and economic freedom for achieving the types of normative ends that were of interest to me at the time due to my sympathies for radical leftism. And so I think that's what's so powerful about Lavoie's book. And I think we try and bring those same insights to contemporary debates about climate change.
Yeah, so for me, my interest in Lavoie has multiple facets. I read National Economic Planning, What Is Left, quite late in the piece in terms of my own sort of self-discovery of sort of Lavoie's work. What I sort of stumbled upon initially with Lavoie is his sort of work on a sort of hermeneutics. So basically interpretation and meaning and understanding with respect to economic phenomena. So, and this in itself sort of has some multiple sort of dimensions. So, for example, a successful entrepreneur will not only be successfully discovering an economic opportunity, a profitable economic opportunity, but that profitable economic opportunity in itself is a function of being actually sort of culturally aware or socially aware of what other people, including and importantly, sort of consumers, actually want. And this can be a variable across sort of different sort of cultural contexts. And I guess a sort of a really, I guess, a pointed way of sort of putting this sort of hermeneuticist idea across is to think about sort of Hayek sort of famously sort of talks about sort of prices as a communication system with respect to an example, a trite example that he sort of advances with respect to the price of tin. Okay, so the price of tin will sort of fluctuate, and economic actors that use tin as an economic import or some other sort of product will respond. But it always sort of seemed rather evident from me after reading sort of Lavoie that people have to engage in some sort of interpretability as to why the price of tin has fluctuated. Is it as the result of, let's say, a natural disaster, let's say to a sort of pertaining to a tin ore in some sort of, sort of furthest reach of the world? Is it as a result of a government policy? So depending on sort of the interpretation of why sort of prices move will have some sort of bearing on how entrepreneurs and other economic actors act. So that's one thing. Another thing that I found really highly attractive about sort of Lavoie's work is his radical appreciation of democracy as an open-ended process. So Lavoie, in some of his sort of late works, explicitly sort of puts forward the criterion of openness in being able to adjudicate essentially sort of the vibrancy and overall health of political systems, and including democracy. And obviously, what distinguishes a democracy in the main from totalitarian systems is that there's going to be a relatively sort of healthy and robust and large degree of openness with respect to various voices feeding in to the sort of democratic political system by providing a range of variegated perspectives, and not only that, but also the willingness of those in positions of authority to want to have themselves open, as it were, or even vulnerable, if you will, to challenges to their authority. So this can come in the form of whistleblowing, and Nathan has actually written some excellent papers about this very point, about about social movements, protest movements. So when you sort of embrace Lavoie's criterion of openness as a desideratum in your political system, you really come to, and I think I get this from what Nathan is saying, a very much radical liberal disposition in favour of democracy. But another thing, and I think this is probably highly pertinent to the paper that we just had published. To my mind, what is really valuable in Lavoie's work, particularly his book, National Economic Planning: What Is Left, is that he actually provides, at least to my thinking, a quite refined, it's certainly a formal taxonomization of planning modalities. So you have comprehensive planning, and you can understand why mid-20th century classical liberals such as Mises and Hayek would depict economic planning as being of a comprehensive nature. Why? Because essentially some of the most important threats to liberalism of that period of time actually practically came in the form of forms of planning under communism, for example, that actually tried to expunge or extinguish markets altogether as the coordinating arena for the fulfillment of wants. So you can understand then why Mises and Hayek would focus upon comprehensive planning, and then from all of that spins out the classic socialist calculation debate, right, which was quite affirmatively won, if you would, in the intellectual space by the likes of Mises and Hayek. But what Lavoie provides is an advancement of this sort of idea, this critique of planning to include non-comprehensive planning, which recognizes some sort of nominal purpose for market institutions, but within a broader context of plan-directed economic coordination and governance. So I think that's what's really very important from the perspective of Lavoie. And what's actually really telling about Lavoie's book is that it's entirely relevant to this day and age in which we live now, especially now, as Nathan has pointed out, with respect to applications to industrial policy. Indeed, Lavoie, writing originally in 1985, actually presented in that book a critique of the political selection of innovation, for example, solar energy generation, as early as 1985. So you can see how relevant this piece of work is. And if I just may, Jordan, I'd like to just sort of draw a brief quote from the book. It's on page 134 if listeners are interested in following up for themselves. But Lavoie is talking about solar and hydroelectricity and other energy generation technologies. And he says this, that government, and I quote, government interference with competitive discovery process will only obstruct its ability to generate and disperse knowledge and will give unearned advantages to some of its rivals at the expense of others. That is exactly what has happened. Economic democracy offers us the absurd spectacle of radical ideologists making politicized decisions for us about which technology our society should adopt. And I think that's really much at the heart of the critique that we present with respect to a war-footing mobilization with respect to climate change mitigation, as if you can marshal all of societal activities, right, for the fulfillment of one sort of political goal. Even as many acknowledge it as being important, climate change mitigation, there is something wrong-headed, which we'll explore later on, certainly during this podcast, as to why a non-comprehensive planning approach that Lavoie critiqued would be a wrong-headed way to go. But I think, that very example and Lavoie's formal presentation of a critique of non-comprehensive planning demonstrates the relevance and validity of Lavoie's arguments for today's economic and policy debates, I think.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, Michaela, you stole a little bit of my thunder there, because I think that non-comprehensive planning part is really, at least to me, the most important insight in Lavoie's book, in that, especially for the modern day, because there are so few examples of comprehensive planning left in the world. But we see non-comprehensive planning, or at least attempts at non-comprehensive planning, on almost every country in almost every conceivable area of public policy. So I think it's really helpful from using Lavoie's perspective is, even in non-comprehensive planning, knowledge problems abound, and non-comprehensive planning is wrapped up with all sorts of power problems, incentive problems that lead to perverse outcomes, injustices, other normative things that we might not like. But I think this is a good point maybe to switch now into like talking about the meat of our paper. And so what we're really talking about here is we're critiquing the idea of a so-called war footing, or this militarized climate planning. And so I'm wondering, for people who are unfamiliar with this concept, how would you describe what a war footing is, and why are really intelligent people drawn to the idea of this kind of war footing?
So, if I may, I mean that's an excellent question, and I agree. It actually gets really to the heart of our paper. So, look, there's certainly no doubt that one of the totemic issues of our age is climate change and the possibilities of mitigating the effects of global warming, as opposed to reallocating and repurposing resources to merely adapting to the effects of a warming climate that has already taken place. So, look, I think one might think that, given I guess I'm preempting a little bit of the discussion that is to take place, but what the war footing approach represents a contrast to what I'm about to say, and that is, I think a fair-minded person would think that, given the localized variations of climatological harms and the idiosyncratic capacities of diverse local communities to deal with the effects of global warming in their respective spatial and temporal contexts, that contrast to a sort of whole of society war footing mobilization that, in fact, and in contrast to gradualist, piecemeal, and fundamentally polycentric approach to climate change, would be a most prudent approach. However, there are very important strains of climate change activism, scholarship, and policy. It's interesting how all of those kind of increasingly get wrapped into one, but put that as an aside, that suggests that arguably a much more aggressive approach is required to climate mitigation, based on suppressing greenhouse gas emissions through transformative change to agricultural, energy, manufacturing, construction, transportation, and other socioeconomic systems as necessary and as quickly as possible. So to put this sort of imperative for radical mitigation in its most dramatic form, as certain figures have clearly done in recent years, entire societies need to be mobilized. That's the argument, either comprehensively or non-comprehensively aligning with Lavoie's planning criteria in such a way as if we're collectively relitigating World War II or some other major conflict. So just as during the period from 1939 to 1945, sort of European societies, had to sort of push aside any other sort of social or economic priorities for the sake of sort of fighting a common enemy, right? And from the Allies' perspective, obviously of Nazi Germany. So you must do this with climate change. Climate change mitigation is the number one priority for this war footing approach, and it has to be prosecuted as speedily as possible. So here, the imprimatur of government is necessary to mobilize or remobilize economic production, the use of labor, even the application of public finance and regulatory systems to rapidly mitigate climate change drivers and effects. So And even some of the suggestions promulgated by climate war footing advocates are, in my view, rather disturbingly paternalistic and highly prejudicial to the exercise of human autonomy and democratic decision making. So that's what this whole war footing argument's about. There are numerous figures, as I've mentioned, that advocate such a war footing response to climate change, and several names can be mentioned in dispatches: Andreas Malm, Michael Manns, Joseph Stiglitz, Lawrence Delina, whilst others, notably Mariana Mazzucato, have advocated that governments embrace so-called quote-unquote mission-oriented policy to prioritise climate change mitigation over much else. So it is actually intriguing to ponder why it might be that obviously intelligent people are so drawn to this planning mentality, which in this case has been creatively and ideologically repurposed to the subject of climate change. So I think there are multiple sources to explain why people are drawn to the argument. I wonder if there's some sort of socio-political, if not psychological, currency in being able to identify environmental or social or other problems, no matter how great or small in their scope, and transform the articulation of those concerns into concrete forms of social control via public policies that provide the progenitor and other vocal diffusers of problem claims with advantages such as public noticeability and esteem, employment positions, funding, and so on. So there's actually some element, small element, however small, a personal advantage that one gets in being able to creatively design what will seem like a novel argument that will then provide rationalization for a set of policies ex post. I think that Lavoie's investigations into the more contemporary aspects of governmental planning and our effort, which is inspired by Lavoie, probably falls also within the broader domain of political economist James Buchanan's post-Cold War concern that even if managerial socialism of the Soviets had fallen in terms of operationality and credibility, what's been retained in the world is a general unwillingness or inability to let things alone politically, or to allow, in the case of climate change, to allow individuals in their separate local and unique contexts to be able to discover appropriate adaptation and, importantly, mitigation solutions for themselves. So indeed, if a problem claim articulator can successfully prod governments and other major players within modern societies to move in a war footing and militaristic orientation to climate change policy, then the incentivization of policy extremism identified by Lavoie and Buchanan in the form of the power problem is a likely outcome. So in the absence of robust institutional safeguards and norms that rule the likes of war footing measures out of hand, then we're likely to see, I think, more prescriptive policies that try to marshal more and more sections of society, if not a whole society itself, into dealing with this one problem.
I think related to this, there's a couple of reasons that advocates of the war footing don't think that the types of bottom up and market driven approaches that we might be more sympathetic to could work. One relates to the notion of externalities, right? Every instance of carbon dioxide emissions or methane emissions or emissions of other greenhouse gases is an instance in which, say I buy a product that generated some amount of greenhouse gas emissions in its production process. I benefit, and the company that sold me the product benefits. Mutual benefit, win-win, hooray, markets. But there's negative externalities in the form of the emissions that generate harms to dispersed, diffuse groups of people all over the globe via the contribution to global climate change. And because everyone every day is making a bunch of these types of transactions, as well as individual decisions like driving their car a bit longer, choosing to drive rather than take public transit, etc., right? Everyone is making a bunch of these decisions every day, and no one person who's adversely affected by climate change, say their farm winds up going under because weather patterns in their area change, or say their home value goes down because they're in an area that is currently a coastline but becomes a flood zone due to rising sea levels, right? All of those people can't identify individually, oh, I need to make a deal with Nathan and say, hey, you're violating my property rights. Either you pay me to justify what you're doing or not, right? That type of cozy and bargaining is prohibited in some sense by the prohibitively high transaction costs, right? Because so many people all over the world are contributing to this problem, and the people who are directly harmed are also dispersed all over the world, the transaction costs associated with cozy solutions appear to be prohibitive. And that also appears to be prohibitive for property rights based solutions in general. So, one thing that we might expect to work in one context seems like it wouldn't work. And even once we get to political solutions, right, at a more local level, people might say, all right, well, this is a problem of a global public bad, climate change, and alternatively of the generation of a global public good, climate change mitigation. And that means that even if you're embracing political solutions at the national or subnational level, there's the problem of each jurisdiction free riding on the mitigation efforts of other jurisdictions, right? Why adopt costly policies that, at least in the short run, impoverish your constituents in order to contribute to a global public good when that might result in you, for instance, losing your reelection bid next time, right? And meanwhile, some other nation state or subnational government is embracing policies that are conducive to their continued political power and towards their accumulation of wealth. And they're not contributing as much to climate change mitigation, right? So that problem of negative externalities combined with the problem of global public goods leads people to think that it's not incentive compatible to engage in bottom-up efforts to promote climate change mitigation. Another interrelated problem is, of course, the problem of rent seeking. Some people are not thinking of this problem at the level of individual consumer decisions. Instead, they're thinking of it in terms of concentrated power. They're saying, we've had this ongoing, decades-long climate crisis, and there are firms, particularly fossil fuel companies, but also other companies that are invested heavily in production processes that contribute to climate change, that have engaged in rent seeking to maintain a set of political positions that allow them to block the necessary policies to stop or mitigate climate change. That's the argument. And so if that's their view of what's happened, the view could also be, all right, ordinary politics is not going to be enough to dislodge these rent-seeking coalitions. Therefore, we need the kind of crisis that can dislodge existing political coalitions and allow us to exercise the kind of force necessary to bring those who are determined to maintain their current position of privilege at the expense of ordinary people on the planet to stop their current activities, right? And the view is that in order to achieve that, you need a perceived crisis and you need the kinds of concentrated power that governments have marshaled in previous crises. And in particular, the people we're responding to are saying, we want the crisis to be seen as metaphorically analogous to a war, and we want the types of concentrated powers that governments have wielded in previous wars, right? World War II often being the example that they go to, whether they're pointing to something along the lines of the mobilization here in the United States by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration, or whether they're pointing to, as Andreas Malm does, war communism in the Soviet Union. In either case, right, the idea is we need concentrated power and political planning because ordinary democratic processes are hampered by rent seeking, and ordinary attempts at bottom-up solutions to these, whether that's cozy and bargaining or the use of multiple levels of government in a polycentric world system to try to mitigate climate change, those are hampered by problems of externalities and public goods. And so I think that's part of how they're seeing the problem situation. And that's why they're trying to see more radical solutions, because they've spent years looking at what they see as an escalating crisis, saying this isn't being solved, this isn't being addressed, the solutions that are being implemented are insufficient, and we need something big to stop it. I think that's the view.
Yeah, that's great. And I was thinking, both from Michaela's points and then now Nathan's points, a couple things came to mind. In kind of the list of names that Michaela gave out of these people thinking in this war footing thing, and then Nathan, I think you were good to bring up the difference between the way that people use the militaristic language. One is metaphorical, the other is war as a metaphor, like war as a blueprint, war as a blueprint for what to do. And so I just wanted to highlight a few of the like ideas and quotes that we had found. So like United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he described, climate emergency as, quote, a battle for our lives. It's a battle, this war metaphor. We also have the US based advocacy group Climate Mobilization. They're proponents of this war framing, which is intended to what they call the muscular and patriotic sense of those who would otherwise discount or ignore environmental messaging. Nathan brought up, the idea from Malm about replicating the Bolshevik war communism mode of planning, like literal implementation of that style of planning into climate change. We have some interesting quote from Ross Mitiga that I found very fascinating, especially for people with, liberal sensibilities or liberal sympathies. He writes, while authoritarianism is in general lamentable, having a government unencumbered by democratic procedures or constitutional limits on power could be advantageous when it comes to implementing urgently needed climate action, which is kind of what we see, obviously, in times of war. Is normal constitutional constraints are relaxed. People in governmental power can use that power to accomplish the ends, but that is also assuming a fairly benevolent person who holds the reins, and that may not always be the case.
So, in terms of the various figures who advocate for a wholesale sort of mobilization of societies to rapidly mitigate climate change, you can actually read through all the various proposals Don Lavoie's criteria of comprehensive and non-comprehensive planning, and you can consider comprehensive versus non-comprehensive as something of a spectrum. Indeed, that's exactly what we identify in the paper. And just to sort of go back to some of the proposals being outlined by the advocates of this climate change war footing, there is a measurable degree of paternalism in the sort of recommendations. So you might imagine a sort of a non-comprehensive sort of scheme of planning, which has been articulated by some of the advocates. I'm not making this up by any stretch, where you might have relative freedom of production, but on the consumption side of the market, you're going to have quite stringent controls over individual purchases with respect to, let's say, surveillance and other technological systems by which you can gauge the carbon footprint, let's say, associated with products. And Nathan spoke about this earlier. And so from the ability to use surveillance and metering technologies to track or to measure the carbon footprint associated with the consumption of goods, let alone putting aside the production thereof, it's possible to then engage in schemes of carbon rationing, which is actually what some of the advocates of the war footing propose. So in a replication of the World War II modes of regulation, the suggestion is that indeed there should be actually carbon rationing on the consumption side of the economy. And one can reasonably ask, I think, using a Lavoisian perspective, is, how far does one ought to go with respect to even what might seem as to be sort of rather mild, non-comprehensive modes of planning? You might find that the desire to engage in planning might well be combined with the socio-psychological intolerance of greenhouse gas emissions, or even of those sort of actors who are sort of identified as being implicated in the emission of such greenhouse gases to engage in ever more prescriptive controls over the economy. And the question is, where do you really draw the line with these questions? There seems to be no firm line by which one might stop if you're going to implement a war footing with relish.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to pivot from what advocates for a war footing are arguing. And obviously, as Michaela has alluded to, and then Nathan talked about before, is like these global level externalities, just the sheer scale of the problem, and then also entrenched interests being really hard to overcome might lead people to believe we need this kind of centralized top-down war-like planning. And then in our paper, we provide pushback against that by bringing up the idea of knowledge problems, incentive problems, and then militarism problems. I'm wondering what the two of you think about, out of those kind of three problems that we highlight in our paper, do you think there's one that's especially underappreciated by both scholars and regular citizens? Or do you think there's one that should maybe be more emphasized out in the world for people who are potentially thinking about, oh yeah, we should do a war footing? Is there one that, really maybe we should hit home?
I think there's possibly a case to be made that actually all three kinds of problems that we've identified in the paper as vulnerabilities of a war footing mobilization approach to climate change remain persistent in academic and popular discourses. So you're going to get sort of messages and units of advocacy, if you will, that potentially evade each of these sort of three problems. But then that said, you might be able to trace at least an acknowledgement of at least a couple of the problems at hand. So, for example, one might be able to trace some commentaries which could be read as shorthand for the more nuanced or intricate identification of problems by political economists. So, for example, the popular sentiment that political actors such as legislators and bureaucrats are in position of authority for self-promotion and benefit, as opposed to public service for all on a non-discriminatory basis, is one that can be increasingly found in current political discourses, even if it might not necessarily be related directly to climate change. Now, Nathan really beautifully laid this out in his description of rent-seeking as a form of incentive problem, but this is the incentive problem in short. So you can see some, really rough and ready laypersons commentaries that allude to the incentive problem that exists, right, in climate change policy. You see it, but not really, particularly in a sort of in a finely grained academic form that sort of we scholars might tend to write. You might also occasionally find a somewhat unrefined, if not crude, interpretation of the knowledge problem in popular discussions over political issues, insofar as clear and obvious cases of government failure are meant with either a sense of incredulity or epistemic exasperation. So, in short, the idea here is, well, how can policymaker X be so nitwitted, as it were, in pursuing policy plan Y that seems obvious in the first instance to not work? Okay, so you'll get some sort of layperson sentimentality surrounding that. But certainly, as important as knowledge and incentive problems are, I often wonder if actually the power problem that was so vividly chronicled by Lavoie in his book National Economic Planning remains a serious issue that remains underappreciated in democratic society. So I think our paper provides a very neat account of the power problem. So following Lavoie's contributions, we are saying, and I'm drawing out of the paper itself, that people can come back and inspect later on. But we're saying that, and I quote, political actors may become increasingly intolerant of alternative positions to climate change as time unfolds, potentially translating into increasingly prescriptive exercises in socio-economic coercion, close quote. So militarism is what we identify as particular and certainly disconcerting aspects of the power problem in general. And militarism here is basically a set of beliefs that officials adopt to justify their use of violence and coercion during military interventions. Now, Chris Coyne has adopted that concept in the past, that Nathan has as well in his separate research. But I think we identify three main problems with militarism. So the first one is that it cultivates a liberal mindsets among key governmental decision makers and the general population, right? And that in turn bears the risk of generating a mindset of conformity and obedience, right, to dictate, in this case, in climate policy on a war footing. B, militarism has a problem because it can potentially, in fact, very clearly, in fact, erode the rule of law and democratic governance, because militarism creates a tendency to select policymakers who comfortably wield coercive power. Now, this is actually Hayek's 1944 identification of why the worst get on top, as it were. And finally, militarism is a big problem here as we see it, because it's likely to lead decision makers to be more aggressive toward others and to be actually more tolerant rather than less tolerant of coercive and violent rather than peaceful solutions. Now, if you tend to think that climate change is the existential moral challenge of our lifetimes and is the sort of the sole issue that you must subordinate the whole of society into, in terms of policy, in terms of practice, technological adoption, and so on, you're not going to look very kindly if you are possessed of a militaristic mindset toward alternative viewpoints. I would imagine that, given the sort of the complex implications and consequences of climate change, that it's actually very well fitted to what we would describe as a polycentric approach to climate change adaptation and mitigation, but a militaristic mindset seems to close this off. So we think that a war-footing disposition to dealing with climate change is what we're identifying here as a clear-cut example of militarism, and more broadly an application of the power problem. Now, whilst it's true that some climate war-footing advocates agree to at least some nominal role for markets and civil society in the task of mitigating the effects of climate change, there seems to be a disturbing underlying intolerance for the historically emergent economic, social, and technological systems which are indicted in toto on charges of producing climatological ills, for which the solution is being presented as a regimentation of other people's lives, aspirations, and priorities. So we think that, well, I certainly think that the power problem, the militarism problem, is the one that's probably arguably least appreciated. I don't know if Nathan has an alternative view or whether you do yourself, Jordan, but I think I could make a case for that.
I definitely think that the militarism problem is underappreciated, right? I would be inclined to agree with Michaela on that. But I do think that at least some of the climate activists, those involved in more grassroots action, might be more prone to appreciating it than some others in our society, because they're directly experiencing militarism problems when they attempt to do on-the-ground activism, right? So if we think about unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, which have been developed largely for use in foreign wars, Predator drones dropping bombs on people in Pakistan as part of the global war on terror, for example. Well, those have been brought home and are used by the Border Patrol for surveillance purposes. But now the Border Patrol lends those to various state, local, and federal law enforcement agencies. Well, what do they do with those drones? Well, some of what they do with those drones is they surveil environmental and indigenous rights protesters who are protesting, for instance, the construction of fossil fuel pipelines. And so there are some climate activists who are directly involved in actions where they're seen and then filing FOIA requests and legal actions related to militarized technologies of social control and surveillance being wielded against them. They're experiencing riot police who are using techniques and practices that were at first cultivated through US wars abroad, but then brought home for the formation of SWAT teams, as our colleagues Chris Coyne and Abby Hall document in their book, Tyranny Comes Home. They're experiencing the direct results of those forms of police militarization. And abroad, we see various climate activists and environmental activists and indigenous rights activists sometimes being killed, right? So Berta Cáceres being one high profile example. And so I think to some extent, those who are involved in the more grassroots side of the climate movement might find themselves really sympathizing with our points about militarism problems because they live it, they see it. They engage in forms of activism where they see what militarized use of social control, force, surveillance, regimentation, militarized policing, and so on looks like. And so I think along those margins, at least some people in the climate movement, the people who aren't the technocrats envisioning themselves as the climate czar, right? The people who are instead envisioning themselves in a position of a person who is more interested in engaging in grassroots action, those people are going to envision the problems with militarism. But what they're not necessarily going to envision is the knowledge problem. And I think part of why the knowledge problem is likely to be underrated in this context is that climate change is often talked about as a scientific technical issue, right? The issue is just slow down the increase in global temperatures by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, right? And if you're conceptualizing it in this scientific technical sense, you're just saying, all right, we have an output target, reduce the emissions, right? And if that's your goal, well, that's the kind of problem that you can, in principle, solve without relying on the context specific knowledge of millions of people dispersed throughout an economic system. We know how to do it, just reduce the various activities that produce the emissions. But once you keep in mind that part of the reason you care about climate change is that it might adversely affect human well-being, right? Once you're putting yourself in the mindset that the very problem with climate change, or at least a big part of the problem with climate change, is that it's going to harm people's lives and livelihoods because people have made a series of plans, have lived in places that have particular temperatures, particular climates, particular weather patterns, and so on. And climate change is changing those weather patterns, those climates, those conditions in a manner that means that their old plans need to be revised, right? Once you realize that the harms to human well-being relate to a variety of complex trade-offs, then you come to see, oh, actually mitigating climate change in a way that mitigates the issues we care about involves a bunch of trade-offs, right? You don't just want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at all costs, right? Instead, you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a way that winds up preserving and perhaps even increasing human well-being. And in order to know what increases human well-being, you need knowledge of what people subjectively value. You need knowledge about the trade-offs associated with alternative plans for coordinating the use of scarce resources to produce goods and services that people value. And that knowledge can only be generated and discovered through bottom-up polycentric processes, including and especially the market process. And so I think because many people are oriented towards seeing climate change as a scientific and technological problem, they're likely to neglect the knowledge problem because they don't necessarily see how salient it is that climate change results from production processes that are serving human needs of various sorts and human wants of various sorts, and that at least part of why climate change is objectionable and worth trying to mitigate is that it disrupts people's production and consumption plans, people's plans for living their lives, and potentially harms human well-being. So figuring out a way to mitigate climate change while also increasing or at least not drastically reducing human well-being, that requires the kind of knowledge generated through bottom-up market processes. And attempts at militarized climate planning are going to hamper that process. So I agree with you that militarism problems are very important, neglected by many people, but I think at least some climate activists are likely to be more aware of militarism problems because if they're involved in the kinds of risky, contentious grassroots action that gets militaristically suppressed, they are going to see those problems in action. But they might be less attentive to the knowledge problem, both due to ideological blinders related to thinking of things through more of a socialist planning type mindset, and due to blinders related to thinking of climate change principally as a scientific technical problem rather than a complex socioeconomic problem.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that both of you said. And I was just going to maybe add on one other idea to why knowledge problems associated with climate change and climate planning is actually underrated by both policymakers and kind of the general public is, I mean, obviously there are both causes and consequences of climate change. And, the causes, electricity generation, industry, transportation, agriculture, you name it. And then the consequences, some places get drier, some places get wetter, sea level rises, but that sea level rising affects different places differently. You have ocean acidification, but that affects. So just the sheer complexity of climate change, both the causes and the consequences, is so immense and so disparate depending on where you are and who you are and your preferences. I think that sheer complexity makes the knowledge problem even bigger. And so I think in the presence of this sheer complexity, that's where, a prescribed plan from the top down is problematic because it doesn't facilitate the discovery of new knowledge that might be really important. And so, like, we simply don't know what we don't know. So, new and better, cleaner means of electricity generation, new and better and cleaner means of, industry, of transportation, of agriculture, like you name it, that has to be discovered in a bottom up process as opposed to implemented from the top down. If we implement from the top down, we're kind of frozen in time. Discovery is much slower. And so, yeah, that's just like a huge epistemic barrier for the sheer complexity of the problem on both the causes and the consequences side. But I think both of your comments and then this comment here is a nice segue into kind of our response. We spent a lot of time highlighting all the problems with this centralized top-down approach, and then our alternative is this polycentric approach to climate change, which is going to be this decentralized bottom-up approach coming from multiple spheres of human action, government and markets and civil society. And so I wonder how either or both of you would respond to a skeptic of this polycentric approach. If climate change is this truly dire problem, why shouldn't we go for the militarized planning? Like, why would the polycentric approach, if it's bottom up, might it potentially take longer? And if time is of the essence, why not do the top down?
So I think Nathan had sort of laid down some of the ingredients for a response to those sort of questions quite nicely, and that is to say initially that climate impacts, and you've done this too, incidentally, Jordan, of course, is that climate impacts are not uniformly experienced in a complex biophysical process of atmospheric and planetary dynamics. That's the first thing that would serve as a platform for a response to a polycentrism perspective. But I'd go further to actually say, putting aside that, as important as it is, I'd say that diverse individuals, they're the carriers of alternative perceptions, opinions, beliefs, and attitudes regarding the severity of climate change in space and time as it pertains to them, as well as the most culturally, economically, scientifically, socially, and technologically feasible solutions to climate change. It doesn't strike me as being at all true that among the many sort of array of, let's say, technological solutions to rapidly mitigate climate change are necessarily going to be applicable or even sort of feasible on every sort of corner of the globe. There are going to be sort of not only climatological but also economic conditions, let's say in the southern hemisphere, which will vary from that. The northern hemisphere, you obviously have levels of economic development. You'll have sort of affordability issues and matters of technical sort of feasibility. And so in that sort of polycentric environment, it's best to actually allow for bottom-up, emergent, iterative discoveries by people who are possessed with the sort of the most intense concern, the most intense interest to deal with the climate change problem, recognizing And I trust it's not a contentious point, but I think it needs to be said that not everyone will sort of be possessed of the sort of the same sort of sense of intensity or even prioritization toward climate change as some others will be. I think that's just a sort of a very evident, observable sort of social fact of the world. And so, given that, I think there really needs to be sort of free polycentric spaces, and that includes roles for government. We're not eliminating any consideration of governmental activity at all from our sort of polycentric approach, but to say that the best approach, given sort of the spread of knowledge, given the existence of variegated incentives, and in the desire to avoid the concentration of public power, it's best to assume a Lavoisian approach to political economy that suggests, in fact, how knowledge, incentive, and power, read militarism problems, can interrelatedly be referred to in a critique of advocacy and tangible effort to mobilize entire populations to the advancement of an arguably reductive goal of rapid climate change mitigation. And I think a final point I would actually make in terms of trying to rebut sort of any sort of skeptics of a polycentric approach is that who makes any sort of singular individual or singular authority the boss, right? So, I mean, it's a fundamental sort of question of public governance. Who makes you the boss, right, of directing and overseeing a sort of war footing mobilization for countless millions of people? We know as a sort of fact in contemporary democratic societies, certainly in election sort of periods, and we're sort of about to get into one, in the US, for example, that issues tend to get sort of bundled up together, right, in certain candidates that offer themselves up for office. And so it becomes very, very difficult, and it's very difficult to command, indeed, legitimacy, right, for a sort of a war footing for climate change when such issues are wrapped up in any innumerable additional issues that voters may sort of wish to decide upon when making their deliberations at the ballot box. So I think there are a range of arguments that could be made in a sort of a friendly, but I'm sure very robust discussion with the skeptics of the polycentric alternative to a war footing mobilization for climate change.
I think that there's a few different ways to respond to the skeptics, and Michaela has presented some really important responses that can be delivered. I think an additional line of response involves responding to a particular type of argument that the skeptics might make, which is going back to that global public goods problem that I mentioned earlier, right? They might say, look, a polycentric approach works well when individuals are operating decision units that are set to the scale of the externality. The scale of the externality here is global. Therefore, we need a global or at least very large decision-making unit to resolve it and to use force to make those who would free ride or defect from our cooperative efforts to fix the climate get in line, right? We need to incentivize them, and that incentivization has to come from a top-down monocentric unit, might be what they'd say, right? And one thing that we can say in response to this is that, in fact, climate change is not just one externality problem, and it's not just one problem of a global public good. Instead, we see nested externalities. So, for instance, suppose we're talking about reducing air pollution because that air pollution contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. Well, local air pollution also generates more localized negative externalities, doesn't it? Right? It generates a variety of contributions to local health problems. And so it might be the case that, yeah, you can't get the incentives aligned if the only reason people might care about this air pollution is because of global climate change. But if people care about reducing the health impacts that come from particulate air pollution in their neighborhood, they might then contribute to some bottom-up project to mitigate that localized air pollution. because of the health problems it's causing for them and their neighbors. And in the process, they contribute to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Likewise, yeah, people might not have incentives to contribute fully to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions if the only cost is global climate change, but the only cost isn't global climate change. Suppose people are remodeling their house to reduce their energy use because that saves them on their energy bill. There's a private benefit, a selective incentive, a reduction in their energy bill that generates some incentive there for them to lower their contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, not from pure benevolence, not from assuming altruism, but because people would like to save money, right? The money they currently spend on energy bills, some of that money could go towards meeting other needs and wants, towards getting them other goods and services that they value, right? And there's a bunch of these different selective incentives, what some in the climate change literature call co-benefits, that can generate incentives for people at multiple scales of organization, whether private, public, or civil society, to contribute to polycentric efforts to reduce and mitigate climate change. So that's part of how I would respond to one objection people would have to the polycentric approach, which is you need to set things to the scale of the externality. The scale of the externality is global. Therefore, we need a global decision-making unit to impose a plan on everyone, right? That view, I think, neglects the nuances and multiple scales of externalities and of private benefits involved in various decisions that could impact things related to climate, right? Another response I would have is Jordan raised this issue of, well, this is urgent. This is a ongoing crisis. It's happening quickly. We therefore need quick decision making. All right, well, we currently don't have, thank goodness, a global militarized decision making structure that can impose plans rapidly upon everyone, right? I think we have more militarization than I'd like within various governments, including the United States government, but it's still not the type of social control infrastructure that can impose currently the types of plans that the climate war footing people would like to impose. And so, yes, this is urgent. And look, you're not the person in charge who can impose these plans by force. You're a person who lives in a community, who engages in choices within a market, who could become or might already be a member of various social movements within your society, right? You are interacting within multiple institutional and organizational settings, and none of those institutional and organizational settings are the institutional and organizational settings of the head of a militarized hierarchy who can impose your plans on everyone. So you should start acting within the space where you actually have scope for action. That is, you should start contributing to the process of polycentric climate change mitigation and adaptation precisely because the problem is urgent. Moreover, because the problem is urgent and it doesn't look like pure mitigation is going to happen to prevent further climate change from occurring, you're also going to need to adapt. And to adapt to a changing climate, you're going to want to be in an institutional environment and have social habits that pertain to being able to adapt your consumption plans, being able to obtain goods and services for yourself, your family, and people in your community, potentially being embedded within social ties and networks of mutual aid that can enable you to help your neighbors as they experience the costs of climate change and to be helped by your neighbors if you experience the costs of climate change. The process of climate change adaptation requires polycentricity. It requires social capital. It requires community. And so the urgency of climate change is a reason not to fantasize about ruling over your fellow people, right? It is instead a reason to engage in and revitalize what Tocqueville called the art and science of association. Because in a changing world, we need the art and science of association in order to survive and thrive together. The urgency of climate change is not a reason to fantasize about being a ruler and playing man of system. It is a reason to build up polycentric modes of social cooperation so that we can survive a changing world.
Yeah, I think those are great. And I think one other addition I would throw on here on the end is this idea of what Nathan was just talking about, this imposition, and then also something that Michaela was talking about before, this kind of the idea of subjective preferences and localized experiences. And what this brings to mind is one of the characteristics of a polycentric governance system is legitimacy and co-production. So if people feel involved in the decision-making processes of the institutions that govern them, whether that's, public, like a government, or private in the organizations, clubs, mutual aid societies that they belong to, when people feel involved, they're more likely to see those governance systems as legitimate. And when they see them as legitimate, they're more likely to actively participate in the monitoring and enforcement of those rules and processes, which again, the Ostroms, call this co-production. You're producing the outcome, you're helping to produce the outcome that you want to partake in. But I think the other side, with this particular focus on the militarized implementation of a top-down plan, I can see a lot of people not viewing that as legitimate. And I can also see people not wanting to willingly participate in something they feel was foisted upon them, as opposed to something that they were actively involved in the creation of, or their, legitimated representatives were involved in the creation of. And so I can imagine a world in which people see these top-down militarized plans as something to ignore and or subvert rather than just like go along with. And I think if people start ignoring and subverting, these top-down climate change policies, there's a chance that the negative unintended consequence would be even worse outcomes than better outcomes. And so in just terms of practical, like if you simply want to achieve your ends, the top-down method may be a worse means of achieving the ends of climate action and effective climate change mitigation, as opposed to this bottom-up process of people discovering, trying things out, building up institutions. Like Nathan just said, this art of association where people build up institutions to engage in conversation and persuasion with one another, as opposed to, you must do as I say, and if you don't, you're going to get it.
Yeah. So I think that the point you just raised here, Jordan, is really important. And I think that in the wake of the death of the political scientist and anthropologist James C. Scott, who wrote a bunch on the sort of art of not being governed, the way states try to impose legibility, and the various everyday ways that people evade and resist systems of state control, this is really important to think about. And I think one resource that we have for thinking about this and how it might play out in a context of various efforts at climate planning and energy rationing and so on is to look at speculative fiction that people have written about these sorts of environments. So I recently read a short story called Solar Shades by Andrew Dana Hudson that looks at sort of a near future area around Portland, Oregon. And you've got climate refugees from California and Mexico who are living in kind of encampments. You've also got sort of people in the kind of ruins of suburban Portland, Oregon, and all of them are engaged in kind of off the grid energy use that is in violation of governmental energy rationing schemes. And what the main character in this story does is gets involved in a sort of community organizing campaign to try to get recognition and acceptance for the energy practices on the ground so that they can more participate in society in a way that is more equitable and more recognized, right? He's pushing for recognition so that they don't have to be living in this illegible way under these rationing schemes, right? And so I think that you see similar visions in a variety of other types of climate dystopia type fiction, right? Like Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. You'll see a lot of disparate communities in an area, in a place ravaged by climate change that are engaged in conflict with one another and trying to engage in various sorts of evasion, right? Or trying to hold on to what's theirs in a world of increasing scarcity, right? And so I think that people who are worried about climate change are worried about the types of problems that could arise if you get this type of top-down control. And I think that by pointing out the ways in which our understanding of social science reinforces those fears, but also offers hope for bottom-up approaches to dealing with this better, I think that is a way that social science can complement the types of thinking that people are doing through their political organizing, their speculative fiction, and their other ways of thinking about the world to really think about how we could have an approach that really leverages, as you say, co-production by ordinary people rather than men of system trying to push people around and in the process driving them into underground patterns of organization that involve trying to subvert the climate change mitigation plans imposed by others.
And for our conversation to kind of wrap up here, in the conclusion of our paper, we say that policymakers, citizens, activists should shift their mindset from this climate war kind of metaphor to a climate peace metaphor. And this is kind of one of our ongoing projects to explore what climate peace means and how to engage in it. Obviously, in this paper, we didn't go into a lot of detail. And so I'd be curious to hear your kind of preliminary thoughts on what you think the climate peace framework entails. And I think we've already kind of preempted some of it, but I was wondering if you have any other thoughts on kind of the climate peace framework.
So I think this is an idea that Nathan has coined. So sort of full credit to him on this, and I think it sort of illuminates something very important that actually complements the polycentricity sort of perspective that we've offered in this paper. I know that Jordan, you have done so in a different paper with Bobby Herzberg as well. And so I think if there are going to be some fundaments to climate peace, I would identify at least a couple. So it would seem abundantly evident to me that the maintenance of polycentric spaces for the prosecution of climate change initiatives with a meaningful representation of corporate and civil societal activities which are promulgated relatively autonomously and also as the need requires in collaboration with other actors in diverse systems. I mean, that's going to have to be the basis for a climate peace. As I indicated before, sort of a sort of war footing mobilization represents a clear contrast to the idea of climate peace because it is a contemporary species of militarism, and is subject to Lavoie's original critique of the power problem. So you need polycentricity. I also happen to think that building norms is going to be important because building norms can by and large be prosecuted bottom up through a whole range of diverse collective vehicles and through a whole range of heterotopic spaces. I can think of a whole range of, you can call them cultural movements that might find themselves attached topically to the issues of climate change, which primarily work not through trying to influence politics or to try to be a participant in what you might call insider politics, but is actually trying to work at the grassroots at various levels with people in order to sort of persuade people about the importance, the significance, and the severity of climate change as a problem, and to engage people constructively in some sort of co-produced process of working out acceptable adaptation and mitigation responses to climate change. I guess to some extent, the war footing approach actually strikes me as somewhat odd. For if the norms have been established already that the majoritarian public believes that some component of global warming is induced by human activity and that something needs to be done about it, and I think my reading is that is the consensus, then it seems curious to me as to why then political heavy-handedness and policy forcefulness under the sort of the war footing mobilization approach would actually even be necessary. We not only live in a world of policy, we live in a world of norms where there's every possibility to generate shared meanings and understandings about the very nature of the climate change issues and come to some sort of reasonable agreement, at least among some important actors within polycentric spaces, as to what to constructively do about in terms of reconfiguring technological, economic, and other systems. think finally, and this sort of interrelates with the other 2 points I'll make, and I'm sure that Nathan will have some additional perspectives as well, is that toleration actually is really important here. An ethic of toleration, if not respect, for divergent perspectives on climate change. So here sort of rests Don Lavoie's sort of ultimate priority for democratic openness, where even those who are quite sort of skeptical about the severity of climate change and any given sort of kinds of solutions to climate change have as much of an airing and deserve as much of a hearing as people who are very strongly in the sort of space of advocacy to affirmatively and concertedly wish to do something about climate change as a problem. I think toleration is extremely important, and it is a concern that I've outlined earlier, that the war footing approach to climate change is advocated by the Andreas Malms of this world, and the Stiglitzes and maybe the Mazzucatos of the world, probably fundamentally reflects an underlying intoleration, a lack of tolerance towards the alternative perspectives that you might actually need in order to learn something constructive about how to deal with the problem. Of assuming, of course, that a critical sufficient mass of individuals, and I think they would agree that climate change is a problem.
I think that Michaela's points there are all very important. I think part of how I think about the climate peace framing is in contrast to several different ways of thinking about the relationship between climate change and war. So what we've been discussing here, the war footing advocates, is the notion that some people have of war, or at least warlike mobilization and social control, as a solution to climate change. But we can also think about climate change as a cause of war. So there are various people who are worried that as climate change gets more severe, various types of conflicts over scarce resources, over land, and so on are going to also become more severe, right? And so there, the idea is climate change is going to create increasing scarcity. It's going to result in people needing to revise their plans in ways that put them in conflict with others, and those conflicts are going to escalate to violence. And another thing we can think about is war as a cause of climate change. And Jordan, I know you're working on a paper with Abby Hall and Chris Coyne on how the military sector generates a lot of pollution, and some of that pollution is greenhouse gas emissions that contributes significantly to climate change. I know there's been some work by folks at the Cost of War Project on this as well, right? The US military sector is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And so we can think of war as a cause of climate change. And so from that perspective, climate peace could be thought about as, in order to mitigate climate change, we should adopt a more peaceful mode of policymaking and of interaction so that we're not engaging in these climate destroying warfare activities. We can think of climate change as a cause of war. And in that context, we can ask, okay, what conflict situations are likely to arise due to harms from climate change? And what would peaceful ways of mitigating those conflict situations look like? And there we could look to, for instance, the work of Elise Boulding on cultures of peace and ask, how do people who find themselves in conflict situations where they genuinely have conflicting interests and conflicting goals, how can they use norms and mediation and various forms of bottom-up interaction to turn a conflict situation into a situation where that conflict is resolved peaceably rather than resolved through militarized violence? And then when it comes to the issue of war and coercion as a solution to climate change, we can ask instead, how can people from the bottom up who have divergent perspectives on how we ought to deal with climate change, how can they interact in a manner that allow them to resolve their differences peaceably, that allows them to engage in shared projects together despite their differences, to engage in social cooperation from the bottom up that allow them to peaceably interact? And there are a range of different arenas we can apply this to, right? So Jordan, you have a paper that is hopefully going to be in the forthcoming special issue of Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence that Chris Coyne is editing on the economics of pacifism and nonviolence, where you're looking at free market environmentalism, for instance, as a type of peaceful resolution of social conflicts, where you take a situation that might be conflictual and through markets make it instead a situation where there's opportunities for mutual benefit. And so a situation that might ordinarily be a conflict situation can, in fact, move into a non-conflict situation of mutual benefit, right? And of course, Michaela and I have a paper with our colleague Yael Shami for that same special issue on polycentric peace, where we look at how various types of polycentric bottom-up processes, ranging from intergroup contact to social movements to market exchange to civil society, can all wind up being mechanisms by which people build opportunities to peaceably interact with one another. And so we can think of how all of these can play out in the context of climate change. I have a paper with Justus Eninga, who Jordan recently interviewed for this series on the Hayek Program podcast, in which Justus and I look at climate change-induced migration. And people might think, all right, climate change-induced migration is going to be a source of conflict as people who have to move find themselves in conflict with people in the societies they move to. But we also, of course, see peaceful integration of immigrants in a wide range of social contexts, even contexts where immigrant groups might have different cultures or different norms or beliefs than are predominant in the society they move to. And so we can think about how can people from the bottom up engage in processes of trade, entrepreneurship, interaction, cultural exchange, such that climate change-induced immigration becomes a source of climate peace rather than a source of climate change-induced conflict and suffering. And so I think across all these different arenas, we can think about how polycentric interactions from the bottom up allow for peaceful social cooperation as a way of dealing with the challenges induced by climate change and potentially mitigating and adapting to climate change, as opposed to thinking of climate change merely as a zero-sum source of conflict or as something that must be solved through zero-sum conflict and coercion.
Yeah, I think what both of you said there was beautiful and very insightful. The only thing I would add here at the end with the ideas on climate peace is focusing really on the emergent properties of peaceful voluntary interactions. And so, again, the whole idea, as we've been talking about, is climate change is so dire and such a huge problem, we need this top-down planning apparatus. But instead, we can actually get the outcomes that we want from a peaceful, voluntary, bottom-up action actually produces the outcomes that we want. And focusing on this peaceful and voluntary aspect makes me think about markets and market innovations within the peaceful interactions of people within the market. I'm just trying to think of a few examples from the world today. Electric cars and hybrid cars are more affordable than they've ever been. We have more energy efficient lighting and heating and cooling systems than we've ever had. So all these market innovations are leading to increasingly, viable green outcomes that hasn't been centrally planned. And then also, I think, and this goes a bit to some of Michaela's work on social movements. And I think social movements as kind of the realm, I guess, centered in like the civil society sphere. I think social movements are really important for helping change people's worldviews, people who may not have cared about climate change or may not have affected them at all. I think through conversation, interacting with people in social movements can change their worldviews so that they're more conscious of maybe what they consume. And I think also interacting with these social movements is a way to engage in conversation and rhetoric that can persuade one another to change their behavior and again, this rhetoric, this persuasion is peaceful. It's through conversation. It's not through the threat of force and violence. And so, focusing on the emergent properties of these peaceful voluntary interactions, I think is kind of a foundational key to climate peace. I think with that, this is a good place to wrap up our conversation. I want to thank Michaela and Nathan for joining us today, and it was a pleasure to work on this paper with you.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you both so much. It's been a pleasure working with both of you on this paper, and I look forward to our future collaborations and conversations.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.